I have grown dozens of podcasts from zero to multiple dozens of thousands of downloads per month, if not even hundreds of thousands of downloads per month. I have also made podcasts go from unranked to top 5 in the Apple Podcast charts in the marketing category in the United States with a super niche podcast, and even made a podcast go from nothing to top 10% podcast globally in less than a month. And in this video, I'm going to teach you everything I learned doing this for dozens of podcasts. Number 1, it all starts with content. Riches are in the niches. Nowadays, we have many podcasts that are already super successful, and it's hard to go out there and just start a very generalist podcast that is going to have to compete with well-established podcasts for some people who are here for decades already. Now, the trick here is to choose a very specific niche. What is it that you're really passionate about? If you're a business owner, what is it that your service is about? And how can you help people for that very specific need with a podcast? And it all starts with research. What is it that people are actually looking for or searching for in your niche? What we typically do is that we go on Google Keywords Planner, on Google Trends, on Quora, on Reddit, on social media trends. What is it that people are actually looking for? What is it that people are interested in? What are the specific terms that they are looking for? So we make sure that we create content that matches this demand within our niche. It's also a matter of positioning. If you want to start a podcast about self-development, which is amazing, but you need to know that there are already dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands, if not even more, podcasts about self-improvement and self-development already. So what is going to be your unique approach? What is going to be your unique angle that people know that if they want to tackle a very specific point of their self-development, they must come on your podcast because this is exactly what you are talking about. Think about Pickable, for instance. Do you want to talk about Pickable? Do you want to talk about Pickable for men? Do you want to talk about Pickable for men above 70 years old? Do you want to talk about Pickable for men of more than 70 years old who live in Cape Town? Here you cannot be more niche, but that also means that anybody who is a man playing Pickable of more than 70 years old in Cape Town will have you as the reference and the go-to person to talk about Pickable for men of more than 70 years old living in Cape Town. Now, this is obviously a bit of a simple example, but this is a very representative of the reality, meaning if you nail a very specific avatar, a very specific niche for whom you become the go-to resource, and if you become the go-to person to consume content from, they will go to you. And this is why riches are in the niches. This is why you want to start with a very narrow topic, narrow niche. And potentially once you've nailed that niche, you want to expand. Now, there is also a choice to be made around categories, right? If you're trying to rank for Apple Podcast charts or in the Spotify charts, you've seen that you have different categories that you can rank for. So here it's interesting to look into, depending on your niche, obviously, what are the most relevant categories. Do you want to try and rank for business or business news or management or marketing maybe? And depending on your choice, you might have to compete with much stronger and bigger podcasts than a blue ocean where it's much easier to rank. Now, and to finish on content, but also to come back to the riches are in the niches. You want people to be finding your content because you are the only person out there providing content for exactly what they need. And when you know exactly what your audience or what your ideal client pain point is, then you can cater to those specific problems and talk about this specifically. Number 2, podcast SEO. So there is a whole thing around podcast SEO. It's a bit of a science, but also a bit of an art because nobody actually knows how the algorithm works. But let me tell you what we've learned and what we've seen work for all the podcasts that we've grown and either made a rank in the charts or explode in terms of audience. Podcast SEO is like general SEO, but 20 years back. Meaning, if you're a marketer, you probably know that 20 years ago, in order to rank in Google, you needed to do a lot of keyword stuffing. Well, it's a bit the same thing for podcasts, actually. And to make it simple, what you want to do is that you want to identify all the keywords that people are actually looking for and usually typing on their little algorithm or the little podcast platform so that your podcast has a higher chance of ranking high for those specific keywords. Because if you talk about dog food, maybe it would be good for people trying to find dog nutrition or dog wellness or dog health for them to find your podcast. So it's all about positioning yourself on the right keyword so that more people can find out about your stuff. And this applies to all the specificities of your podcast, starting with the podcast name, because maybe you want to have a specific name like Dog Dream or the Sarah Connor Show. I'm taking her as an example because, I love Terminator. But point being, even if you name your podcast after your own name, then how people are supposed to find it for the specific topic that you are talking about. So even if you decide to name your podcast The Sarah Connor Show, then in the platforms have a colon and say a podcast about dog food, dog nutrition, dog wellness, and dog health. And like this, anybody trying to find a podcast about those specific thematics will more easily find your podcast. This is also true for show description. I'm not talking about show notes yet, but show description, meaning what's the description of your show? Do you have specific keywords in there that are helping people find your show more easily? Are you making it easy as well for the podcast platforms to understand what your podcast is about without having to scrape through the transcript of your episodes? The show description is super important because you want to make sure that anybody reading it actually understands who you are, what you do, potentially are prompted towards taking a next step or a next action, but for also them to be able to understand what's in your podcast, like what is it that you're talking about and why are you legit to talk about what you're talking about. So the show description should really fulfill those specific objectives whilst bearing in mind having specific keywords embedded in them. Obviously, titles of episodes are also a big thing, right? Obviously, you will tailor your podcast titles to whatever you're talking about in the episode, but are you structuring the episode titles so that they are easily findable by people? They are easily triggering people into taking the next action, which is listen to the episode. Are you putting in the right keywords, the right questions, the right things that must be in a title to actually get more clicks? So here again, instead of saying weekly news 27th of September, actually have a title that says how to choose the right brand for the food of your dog, or what's the best food brand for my dog. All these kind of things, I guess you get the picture. And last but certainly not least, show notes. So here again in the show notes, I like to structure them a very specific way to make sure that everybody can find their way around it. Basically, the show notes are here for 3 entities, including 2 people. The first one is the podcast platform itself. They need to be able to scrape easily what's in the show notes. They need to scrape easily what is in the show notes to understand what the episode is about and attribute it to the right researchers on their platform. Then you have the second categories, which is the people who haven't listened to the episode yet, but who are curious to find out what's in it before they made the decision of spending an extra 30 to 1 hour before making the effort, before taking the action of listening for 30, 40, 50, maybe even 60 minutes of your episodes. And for them, you want to be structuring the show notes a certain way, starting with 2 or 3 lines, paragraphs of what's in the episode. What is the episode actually about? Then second paragraph, 2 or 3 lines about the speakers. You included. You must assume that you have people listening to you for the first time at every new episode, because if you're doing your job right of growing the podcast, this is what happens. Every time you release a new episode, not only people discover your podcast and your guests, but also you. And they need to be able to build rapport with you so that you can build your podcast and make them come back. So super, super important to have a couple of lines about the guest and about yourself as a host. Then what we like to have is a bullet point list. Not 10 bullet points or 10 times, something like 4 or 5 bullet points of hey, in this episode we talk about, boom, bullet point number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Because these people are able to understand, okay, this is what this episode is about. And for the platforms algorithm, it will also be super straightforward. And last but certainly not least, which is important for the third type of people reading the show notes, links. You want to make it easy for people who have listened to the episode already and who want to take the next step, who want to find out more. You want to make it easy for them to take that next step. So it's super important to, in the show notes, have, again, all the keywords that cater to your specific niche and domain, but you also want to have links towards your website, towards your social media, towards your lead magnet if you have one, towards your email address, even if you want people to reach out to you via email address. Make it easy for people to connect with you, because if you make it easy for them to connect with you, they will, and they will engage with you, they will build trust with you, and they will potentially take the next step with you. Now, a super important thing that not everybody is aware, especially in the podcast world. Some people are oh yeah, but I'm only on LinkedIn. Or I hate Instagram. Or actually, I'm having good results on TikTok, but not on Twitter or X. So here, it's super important to bear in mind that whilst obviously you have a certain avatar in mind and you have a certain type of people listening to you in mind, it might be that some people are happily listening to you on the podcast, but then their go-to platform to find out more about somebody is Instagram. For others, it might be TikTok. For me personally, it's LinkedIn. But you want to be able to make it easy for people to find out more about you, and where they want might be on any of these social media platforms. Of course, focus on the main ones, right? So Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, and YouTube Shorts. But already this is a fair amount of work, but that will allow you to get people to connect with you much more easily. Now, talking about social media, which is our third point, the social media game. So here, I want to break a belief that a lot of people coming to us and have asked us about when it comes to growing a podcast. Is social media the key? Do I just need to extract snippets out of my episode, post them once, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, or even more every week or every new episode for my podcast to grow? Well, actually, it is not that simple, but the answer is that simple. When somebody consumes a piece of short-form content and they potentially even visit your profile on the platform that they've consumed it, what this type of audience is likely to want more of is more short-form content, not necessarily podcasts. So it might be that within 10,000 people seeing a short, a very handful of them will be willing to listen to you on the long form, but the vast majority of them, at best, they will want more short-form content, and at worst, they will just ignore and skip to the next shorts. So it's super important to bear that in mind when people are thinking about, hey, I'm not active enough on social media, this is why my podcast is not growing. It is not that simple. And we've seen it. We've done it for multiple podcasts where it's just like, hey, let's extract some snippets, put them on social medias and see the podcast grow. Now, it's not all negative. Actually, doing so allows you to build an audience on those other platforms whilst not having to record additional content, which is pretty strong if you ask me. Here again, I'm recording this very video. It's going to go on YouTube. It's going to go on my podcast. It's going to go on social media platforms. And this will allow me to grow and nurture an audience on each of those platforms. But it doesn't mean that when I will publish an Instagram reel based on this recording, it will boost my podcast. This is not how it happens, or at least marginally, which is something that you don't want to count on when it comes to growing a podcast. However, again, this is very good to grow an audience on those social media platforms, allow people to have more touch points with you, because it might be that within your existing audience or within people who are thinking about taking the next step with you, purchasing from you, or even sponsoring your show, they might want to check you out on other platforms to see if you're where they want you to be. And this is where it becomes super important. So I'm not saying do not extract snippets out of your podcast and publish them on the social media. I'm saying do this, but do not count on this specifically to grow your podcast. Now, number 4 on how to grow your podcast. And this is actually going to be probably the most important one, or the one that is yet the most valuable and the most impactful. And here I'm talking about email list. So what is even an email list? An email list is a database of people interested in your stuff who you have the contact details of. Now, why an email list? Because if you link the email list to your podcast, then you get people who are interested into your podcast who want to find out more. And once you have their email address, you can email them whatever news you want without spamming them, especially about your new podcast episodes going live. And this is where the magic happens. The people who have gone through the trouble of downloading one of your free ebook, potentially going on a landing page, giving you their email addresses in exchange of something, are much more warm and much more likely to take the next step and potentially come back to listen to more of your episodes. And now, again, once somebody discovers your podcast, they might find it super interesting and super insightful, but are just not reminded enough that your podcast exists and that you're releasing new episodes. Being able and having the capability to land into somebody's email box every week or every 2 weeks or twice a week to announce that new episodes are live and that they could get even more value out of those episodes than they have already had, this is where the magic happens. So email list, very, very good hack. It's super simple to set up. If you have a website, it's just about having a call to action to join an email list. We love to have a free book, a freebie. We want to give value. We want to give a reason for people to want to give their email address, and usually giving even more value really helps that. If you do not have a website, then a simple landing page can definitely do the job. There are tons of websites out there right now that propose exactly this. Proposing a freebie against an email address, life hack in order to grow a podcast. But then the only thing is you actually need to make sure to send an email every time a new episode is live. So you nurture this email list and you also get them to download your episode much more often. All right, tip number 5, featuring big guests. And this is where it becomes a bit more complex than just saying, oh yeah, I'm going to interview, Joe Rogan tomorrow. For those who don't know, Joe Rogan is the biggest podcaster out there. When you want to feature big guests, you have to bear in mind that big guests will only come on your show if there is a trade-off, if they will get value as well, because they know they are very conscious of their audience, they are very conscious of their authority, and at some point, why should I go on a podcast that somebody just started, right? As an authority, I mean. So that you need to have a certain set of fundamentals in place in order for people to come on your podcast, especially the big-time guest. But once you have nailed those fundamentals, which by the way, we can help you have, here is how featuring big guests could skyrocket the growth of your podcast. The first thing, the most obvious one, is you will tap into their audience. You invite a big guest on the show, they are already followed by many people, they come and listen to your podcast because, hey, they want to listen to their favorite influencer, and boom, all of a sudden you get exposed to a much broader, much bigger audience. Now, not all of them will stick around and listen to additional episodes, but it might be that within the audience of your guest, 10, 15, 20, maybe 30% will be like, wait a minute, this podcast is really good. This host is quite insightful. I want to get more of this. They will subscribe to your podcast and potentially come back. And where the magic is if you have captured their email address, then you can send them news about the new episodes as well. Now, there is an interesting debate around authority, right? When you start a podcast, you want to build authority because this is a media channel that allows you to do that very easily and to connect very deeply with your audience. Now, in order to build authority, featuring big guests who already have authority in your niche is very, very interesting. Is very, very smart because you get to not only tap into their audience, but also to associate your image with them. If you do that with a large amount of high authority guests enough, then all of a sudden you become the person who, talk to those authorities. So therefore you are an authority as well, right? You must be. And this is what's super interesting. Now, I also want to put in there that in certain cases, and that will depend mainly on your niche, what you're trying to showcase and what your podcast is for. But it might be that whilst you focus yourself on interviews and making big guests come in, all your audience will just be used to, the guest being the authority. So you need to make sure that you structure the interview and the whole process in a way that makes you perceived as an authority as well. And this might be by giving additional insights to your guest answer. That might be by having a certain debate during the interview and not just, reading the question point blank. This is where the subtlety of the magic happens. Now, once you start inviting big guests, the other thing that you can do is be featured on other podcasts. And this is tip number 6, going on other podcasts within your niche. Now, this one is particularly interesting. Here again, you might want to do this at a specific stage of the life of your podcast, not right away. But this is overall a very good way to, get people to come and listen to your podcast. Why? If you get featured on another person's podcast who is in your niche and you do a great interview and you give great insights and the audience appreciates the interview, then they might be like, wait a second, I actually want to consume more of those. So they might be coming over onto your podcast, especially if you get the opportunity to advertise your podcast on this other podcast. This is a way to do it, just being featured as a guest on other shows. And another way to do it is to do a feed swap. So a feed swap is just to say, hey, I have this episode that I would like to publish on my podcast, but actually I'm open to publishing it on another person's podcast. You can go and prospect and find another podcast in your niche and say, hey, I have recorded this episode, which I think is going to be useful, but I was thinking instead of sharing it to my audience, I could share it to yours. So they get to discover me, you get free content. And in exchange, I could do the same with you. You could record an episode, we put it in front of my audience, and then people might be interested into either or both. And worst case, people stay the same. Best case, they start listening to both our podcast. And this is a very good way to grow. Now, again, what you want to do here is not to put the cart before the horses, because you need to have a certain set of fundamentals in place. You need, first of all, to have a certain number of episodes, right? Because if people find you interesting and insightful on that other podcast, they decide to come over to yours, but you only have a couple of episodes, then they will be like, okay, but there is not much more that I can consume. And on top of that, if you have dozens of episodes live, but you don't have a way to retain those people with an email list, with certain call to actions, with proper show notes, then it's potentially just, advertising out there, but for a product that doesn't have retention. And that's not what you want to be happening with your podcast. Once you have those fundamentals in place, though, you are in a very good place and spot to actually go and get your podcast featured on other people's podcasts. Again, or just by doing a feed swap. Now, last but certainly not least, tip number 7, to actually grow your podcast. And it's actually paying money, like ads, advertising your podcast on certain platforms to get a broader audience to discover it. Now, this is something that we've done multiple times. This is something that people are heavily interested in because it's like, it sounds easy, right? You just throw money and you get an audience. Now, there are a few things to have and bear in mind when you are considering doing paid ads to grow your podcast. The first thing is, which platform, right? Do you want to pay Spotify to feature your podcast higher in the list or even on the main screen? Do you want to pay social medias to be like, hey, I have this podcast, I do a static post and push it to lots of people and eventually some people will want to click and listen to it? Do you want to do this on Google and simply have more people coming to your podcast from Google? The choice of the platform where you advertise, it can be very, very efficient, by the way, but it again will depend heavily on your niche, what is it that you're trying to do, and how you are optimizing the whole funnel. Now, there is a specific set of ads which allows you to display your podcast on specific pages depending on the type of keywords that are on these pages. So you're sure that your podcast is only displayed to people who are actually interested into a certain type of topic. This is called contextual advertising, and this can be very, very efficient, especially for a podcast, because then you get Google AdSense to feature you on pages that only have certain set of keywords, which are ideally within your niche. And like these people are much more likely to come, listen, be interested, and potentially stay on the podcast. Because this is another consequence of the ads. When you start pumping money into advertising your podcast to a broader audience, you will most certainly get immediate results and more people to find out about your podcast, at least click on it and listen to a few seconds. But what you want to actually happen is people consuming your episode, people coming back to listen to your episode, people sticking around. And this is where, back to the fundamentals in place, you need to make sure you have certain of those before you start advertising. Because we've seen so many podcasts, especially before coming to us, just throw money at ads, indeed increasing their reach. But then as soon as they stop the ads, the podcast will just falls and drop to the ground. So it's super important to have a great podcast, a great product to begin with. And then when you start advertising, you get an even broader reach. And this is it. I hope you learned a lot from this video. Let me know in the comments, like the video eventually. If you're listening to this on the podcast, I would love to hear your feedback as well. You can reach out to me, Guillaume Jouvencel, on LinkedIn. I would love to connect with you. Let me know what you thought of the episode. Looking forward to hearing from you. Ciao, ciao.